So my name is Kory Findley. I'm a security consultant at Dark Element LLC, and I'm going to be talking a bit today about URL scanning. Something that really interested me, taking a look at this some months back. Knowing that it's kind of a tool that's used by more defensive security practitioners to go out and look for, any URLs that could be potentially malicious, but also using it to look for data that's just floating around out there on the internet was really surprising. Kind of the stuff that we were able to find, and so I'm just here to talk a bit about that. Okay, do we just move along through the slides? All right, sweet. So we're going to talk a bit. So we're going to talk a bit about kind of the features that come with URL scan, the use cases that are. Sorry, guys, just one sec. Sorry about that. So some of the use cases that we found using the tool, of course, or the site rather, and then kind of the impact to security based on the results that we were getting back from our findings. And then we'll go through some screenshots of, kind of examples of data that we were able to find with URL scan. It's some of the data we decided not to share because it was, too private for us, but we'll go through some screenshots of that and then we'll just kind of wrap it up. So first off, what is URL scan? And straight from, the FAQ of their site, URL scan is a site that uses a Google Chrome browser in headless mode to browse URLs submitted by users. The site records the interaction of the page with the internet, and after the page is finished loading, they annotate those results with additional data sources. And so basically at a high level, URL scan is basically an online web sandbox, right? It can capture and retain every request for any given URL, and that includes the request headers, the response headers, everything in between. Lots of cross-origin requests and embedded redirects can be found there. And like we said, it's generally used by defensive security practitioners to scan URLs that they think is, or think are potentially malicious. And so what do you get out of it when you're using the tool? They provide a full DOM capture for every request. You get all of the headers. You get a similar feature where you can aggregate URLs based on their similarity to the URL that you're scanning or looking at. And you can correlate and aggregate that data across several different selectors like domain name, ASN, things like that. They do have a live feature where you can actually just browse to the live endpoint of their site and you get a 16 pane view at the most current sites being scanned in real time. And that refreshes every 10 seconds. They do also include an API. So there's API support, and you can automate around a lot of the things that we're going to talk about through this presentation. So with that, so search queries, specific searches for, typical sensitive parameters. We can do that using URL scan search queries. So we can actually take their search functionality and plug in things like JWT token, PWD password, etc. Or we can even go and look at we can go look for specific files on a web server that could indicate a vulnerability of some kind. And we kind of go through that in the next few slides. And so really it makes it very easy to find URLs, especially those that have a lot of GET parameters that have sensitive data. And we can use those and kind of test them, see if we can still get to those URLs or if the web app that we're going after is properly configured, and they're maintaining session state well. But here we have a few basic search queries you can do. So like file name colon, and then, whatever file on the web server that you're looking for. You can look for specific domains, and you can chain these together with Boolean queries using like and, or, etc. And so doing that, you can kind of drill down on more specific targets that you're looking for through URL scan. But the syntax to do these search queries is pretty straightforward. So for the live view, that's basically what this looks like in the browser. And you have 16 site pages that are scanned for scanned URLs that are viewable in the web browser, and it refreshes every 10 seconds. And that's kind of what that looks like there. And so it's pretty cool to be able to sit back and just watch your browser refresh with all these images and kind of see what's being scanned out there on the internet. And, definitely some things that'll stand out to you if you watch it long enough. So it's pretty fun stuff. But so the live screenshots, this is like a super important part of kind of what I was doing with this when I tested all of these things a few months back. But the live screenshot technically can allow you to determine if you can still get to a URL, if that page can still load dynamic content or otherwise. And so you can see here that we have a screenshot during the scan from a URL, scanned URL. And so at that time, URL scan basically went out and took a screenshot of this application here. And if we do a live screenshot, we can basically differentiate, between the original screenshot and the one we're getting now in order to determine if we can still get to that site or that page, whatever it may be. And so you can see here from the image that, this is what you're seeing at the time of the scan. This is what you're getting now. And so we know we can still get to that page where we can see a cached email address here in that page, which, kind of stands out a little bit, right? And so with our search queries, in this example here, we basically can do a search on this file name called reset password token, or we can scan this URL or come across it in URL scan and then aggregate similar hosts that also have this token exposed, or also have a get parameter called reset password token. And we can just go through these screenshots and easily determine if we can still use this URL, if it can still be submitted, and we can arbitrarily reset a user's password somewhere. So that is it's pretty cool stuff. And as far as our API support goes, they offer 3 different categories of API support. The endpoints and the structure of their API is very straightforward. And so, like I said before, automating around a lot of this stuff or writing scripts around it would be pretty straightforward. So for our first use case here, because we have a couple use cases with actually using URL scan. The first one we have is actually from a disclosure that we made a few months back to a car manufacturing company. And in this image here, you can see that we found a JWT in a get URL. And so we used a tool called JWT Exploit to analyze that JWT and determine if we could still use it to basically if the token still works, right? We just kind of want to see, what does this token look like? And, is it expired? What's up? So the tool told us, hey, the expiry for the token is here. This is what today is. The JWT might still be valid. There's no encryption. There's no nesting going on. So now we have this JWT and we know that it's not expired. So using that and coupling that with URL scan, we end up determining that we can still get to this piece of infrastructure here and actually look at all of the monitoring across all of these different environments for this vehicle manufacturer. And going back through the URL scan features, we can use live screenshots, and we can use the DOM info that we get back from each loaded page or each page that we request with URL scan and determine if we can still get there. And so we can see that we're able to get to this web page here using that JWT. And moving on, we can actually go through the DOM of the page we can get to and pull out all of the links that go to the various parts of their infrastructure here. And so really, the whole idea around doing this is that, we can basically go on URL scan as, an unauthenticated web client. We're not authenticated anywhere. We don't have to provide an identity to use URL scan to go out and find sites who have these things in URLs or in headers somewhere. It's all stuff that URL scan collects for you, and go out and basically use it to cause destruction somewhere. And so definitely the first interesting use case that we had just from looking at URL scan and just playing with it. And the second one is a little bit cooler. So a WordPress botnet. So how could we use URL scan to drive a botnet? And so since we can search for any specific file name on a web server, we can tailor those search queries towards potential victims of a C2 or botnet, infrastructure of some kind, just by, looking for hosts that are vulnerable to known exploits that we could easily use to get code execution. In this case, it would be a WP setup attack, where we can go out, use URL scan to find basically hosted versions of WordPress that are uninstalled, that have not been connected to a backend database or something, and basically fill in those connection details with an arbitrary database location that we can, at the end of the day, use to set up WordPress on one of these affected web servers and, load an arbitrary WordPress plugin and get code execution on all of this stuff. And so we already know that we can go out and find these hosts pretty easily. We can just search for setupconfig.php using their file name descriptor in their search functionality and get a ton of results back, as you can see here. And using their similar sites feature, it's super easy to also aggregate hosts that are also potentially vulnerable. And so from an automation or scripting standpoint, it would be pretty easily to piece this together, but ultimately you would be, using URL scan to find the targets, and then do all of the arbitrary database setup on the back end for all of these different targets to connect to as you find them and confirm, that they are indeed vulnerable by analyzing the DOM info, which is also provided by URL scan. And so, like right here, we can view the DOM tree of, a potential candidate and look for specific indicators and correlate those to determine that a host would be vulnerable. And all we have to do is just make URL scan searches for all of these things. And so that's really interesting to me, that, we can use URL scan to not only go out and basically find these types of things, but also identify where a web application might be vulnerable to something. Being able to request the same page that has some type of session state mechanism a year later, you can know just based on that a web application is not handling that properly. And so, and we can even supplement our results from doing these things with, for example, searches for WP login.php and going through those loaded pages, those screenshots, and the DOM info itself, and determining if there's cached passwords in some of these hosts that you can find with URL scan. And definitely, at the end of the day, when you kind of tie together what you're getting here and what you can potentially get on Google and what, everything that you can actually correlate and end up scripting around at the end of the day, it makes this, definitely possible to do just by making anonymous web searches on a URL scan. And so kind of what is the impact? Really, what can we find on URL scan? Like I said, we have some screenshots we'll walk through and show of some stuff that's heavily redacted that we were able to find on URL scan. But some of the pieces of info that we definitely were able to find were social security numbers, payment service provider and virtual gift card provider info from DOM captures, JSON web tokens, which we already covered. Ton of instances of either creating user accounts or resetting credentials arbitrarily by doing this, and also session fixation into bank accounts, prod web environments, arbitrary password reset, etc. And of course, the code execution piece that we just talked about around WordPress, which is just one example. And so with that, we'll just roll on into the screenshots that we have prepared for you. And so the first one is tax returns. So here you can see that we were able to easily find tax return documents that contain social security numbers and yearly earnings for an entire family, basically. And so that is definitely a super bad thing. And there is the tax return itself. And really, it's not any fault of URL scan necessarily for being able to find these things. It's whatever application is hosting this file. Because ultimately, like from the approach we're taking, we should not be able to ever get to this data, even if it has been scanned before in the past or for whatever reason. And so definitely, here's our first example of arbitrary account creation. So here's a arbitrary, sorry, here is an arbitrary account reset example of looks like a Deloitte login page here. And so, that was one of the first that we came across that really stood out. Another one, we dynamically generate an email address and then arbitrarily create a new user account on a Barracuda Cloud Control instance. And we're basically abusing functionality that's there from somebody else creating their account, basically reusing a request that somebody else made in the past with all the same headers and so on and so forth. Still shouldn't be able to work at the end of the day, but it definitely does. Moving along, so another arbitrary account creation example, we can basically update a password or create a new password for a user on Cisco WebEx. We have some session fixation examples in here as well. This one in particular was taken from some Proofpoint security training, where we were able to confirm that we could, gain access to a Proofpoint user's security training. This one looks like Introduction to Phishing. So good stuff there. Licensed software, we can basically get some free Microsoft Office from a .edu, I think this was taken from, where we can just, test these requests, going through URL scan, depending on what we're looking for, and end up confirming that we can still get to the same stuff. You just end up finding a lot. Here we have an arbitrary account creation for Uber One login. Let's see here. Some PII for a CGI federal employee that's, lingering inside of a form on a web page that we can still get to, that we can also find with URL scan. Some customer PII for a shipment tracking web page on Best Buy. Some Sios Technology Corp cache credentials right in the web page for a support user. Some account takeover, more of that on whoever this is. I redacted everything out of that screenshot. And so once again, why is this happening? And, the reasons do vary, but they definitely depend on the app itself. You know, in the JWT example, the mechanism responsible for generating the token accepted by the affected web app is configured to use lengthy expiry times, which is true. If that token had been, you know, set to expire after a day, for example, we wouldn't have been able to reuse it and gain access to internal company infrastructure for that affected organization in that way. In the WP setup example, we're basically looking for a specific security flaw that is in WordPress by design in order to build out a botnet. So really, URL scan is awesome for going out and finding these affected apps or affected sites and identifying them based on, you know, certain things and aggregating all of the sensitive data for us. But it's really not URL scan that's doing that. There were a lot of examples of pages that we tried to reload and get to, and it didn't work out because those web apps were configured properly. And also, you know, for those people who are worried about URL scan being able to touch their sites or their infrastructure, it's easy to send an email to URL scan and have them blacklist your domain or whatever you don't want them scanning from their site. So definitely possible to kind of stay out of it if you are worried about your sensitive data on your sites being found in the same way. It looks like I duplicated this slide. Sorry about that. And so that's basically it around kind of that whole tool itself. Really, it wasn't just about using it to, I mean, people know about URL scan, right? Like it's been out there for a while now, but just, you know, the whole focus on what the tool is used for versus what you can actually find and the reason why you're finding it. Definitely tons of great data just laying around out there that a bad guy would have a great day with. And with that, I'm done. Kind of burned through that.